So it's time for the casting portion of the video that I just posted about the coffee mug that I molded to make a rubber copy of that. Now, many of you film buffs out there will remember the very memorable scene in a police station in The Big Lebowski where he gets a coffee cup thrown at his head. And good night, almost 10 years ago, I was asked to do a career day presentation for my kids. And of course I had to reenact some of that with my children. And I wanted one of them to throw a coffee cup at the other. And that led to the original video, which again was almost 10 years old. And that video featured some products that do not exist anymore. So I thought I'd revisit that because I was really proud of that mold. It's kind of a very clever mold, in my opinion, where I made it so that the only seam on the coffee cup was actually inside the handle of the mug. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I'm gonna link to that in the end screen, so be sure to check that out. But what we're going to do in this video is cast this mug. So we've made the mold out of 5110F silicone. This is a great silicone for prop making, especially parts that are going to be seamless glove molds, seamless matrix molds, that sort of thing. This is a fast setting formula. 5110F has about a 7-minute working time at room temperature and then around an hour and a half demold time, also at room temperature. So this is ideal for those kinds of scenarios where you need to make a fast mold, and then of course we could cast one of the fast setting polyurethanes into it in order to make a fast prop. So depending on your situation, you could easily turn a prop around in about half a day or less, because say you're using something like FP, one of the FP series rubbers, that would set up within an hour and a half or so. So very easy to make a fast mold and a fast rubber prop. But in this video, we're actually going to be casting silicone into a silicone mold. This is something a lot of you have asked about casting silicone into silicone. So I thought this would be a good chance to discuss some of the problems that you run into with that and the way to do it and get away with it. And this is I figured this would be a good mold to do this on because this particular mold, because it is a fairly tricky, somewhat complicated mold with some difficult areas to get to, this is a great kind of worst case scenario for casting silicone into silicone. So without further ado, let's get started. Now first we'll need to release our mold since we're going to be casting silicone into silicone. And to do that, it's important that we understand how our part is configured in that mold, because understanding the negative space we're going to be working with will prevent a lot of problems later on. And I say this because sometimes you might be casting into a mold that someone else made. So it's real important to understand how your part is oriented in the mold. And that way you can make sure that all of the surfaces of the mold, all of the inside of the mold, gets properly released. Now, because we're going to be casting silicone into silicone, we want to release this very thoroughly. And the first step in that is I like to wipe down the inside of the mold with pure petroleum jelly. And I say pure petroleum jelly because you want to watch out for products like Vaseline that sometimes have other additives in them, other fragrances and things like that. And that can play havoc on platinum silicone. So make sure that you're using pure petroleum jelly, or if you are using Vaseline, that it's pure Vaseline, that it does not contain any fragrances or other additives that could interfere with the curing of your silicone. Now what I'm doing here is I'm applying it fairly liberally all over the inside of the mold. And I'm going to let that sit for a little bit, sometimes about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I come back and wipe out the excess petroleum jelly. And sometimes you might want to even go in there with a paper towel and remove any excess buildup of petroleum jelly. But letting that sit in the mold, the surface of the silicone actually absorbs that a little bit, and that really helps with the release later on. Now, in addition to the petroleum jelly, we're also going to spray the inside of the mold with mold release. This is an important additional step, but that also is extra insurance against bonding of silicone to silicone. So now we're going to spray a thorough spray of the Zip 301 mold release on the inside. And real important, you see that can says non-silicone mold release. That's an important detail. You never want to use a mold release that's intended for urethanes with silicones. This does not contain any silicone oil, which means it will easily repel those two surfaces. We're going to thoroughly spray that down, and then really important, once we do that, we want to make sure we give that plenty of time to outgas. So we're going to set that aside for at least an hour to let that dry and let any of the propellant outgas. If you don't do that, you could wind up with bubbles or defects on the surface of your part. Now, on a related note, sometimes I'll even flip the mold upside down so that I don't accidentally get any pooling of liquid release when I spray it like that. But just really important to remember, always give the mold time to outgas after you spray a thorough layer of Zip 301 mold release. Now ready to mix and pour our silicone, but first I want to back up a little bit and discuss how I picked out this particular silicone. Now, I'm going with the 1:1 ratio BJB translucent silicones, and I'm using these because these could be used as either a casting material or a mold material. And of course, we have the really soft at the top and firm at the bottom. And we're going to go right in the middle. But really important here, because these are translucent, all of these can be used both for mold making applications as well as casting applications. Real important in the medical simulator and the product development world. So for this, we're going to be casting 5130. And the 5130 is a medium Shore A25 silicone that works great as kind of a general purpose silicone for mold making, but also in this instance, this is going to be a great way to cast our coffee cup in a material that won't be too floppy. So when I shot this video, originally I would have used FP series rubber, but at the time I had some of the 5130F on hand, so I went with that. Now, 5130 comes in two different formulas. The regular 5130 is a 30-minute working time and a 3 to 4 hour demold, and the fast, or the F formula, my personal favorite, is around a 7-minute working time and about an hour and a half demold at room temperature. And of course, this can be thickened with SC-5001. That's really important if you're making brush-on molds or brushed-in casts. And this is really low viscosity, so that's really helpful for a part like this where we're going to be pouring this into a mold rather than using it as a mold material. Now, I'm going to mix this out 1:1 by weight, but this particular formula you could use by weight or volume. Me personally, I really prefer weight, and I can really minimize a lot of mess by doing this all in one mixing cup. So just a personal preference of mine, I really like to weigh everything out when that's appropriate. And that just cuts down on the amount of mixing cups that I use and makes cleanup a lot easier because everything gets mixed together and it's a lot easier to clean out. Now, what I did here that I didn't show is I actually weighed the coffee cup to get a rough idea of the volume. And since ceramic material is more dense, I knew that if I just went with about that amount, or maybe a little bit less than the weight of the coffee cup in silicone, that would be more than enough. Now I'm adding some pigments, and remember the clock is ticking because I got the two components together in the mixing cup. So I want to make sure I don't waste any time. I'm adding my pigment to my two components together in the cup. And now I'm ready to mix the silicone and vacuum degas it. Now remember, our working time is about 7 minutes at room temperature. If you're in a warm environment, it's going to be faster. Cooler environment, it's going to slow it down. So real important to make sure as soon as those two components go together that we remember that time is of the essence. Since this is the F or fast formula, we want to move quick. Now, last week I posted a video on degassing silicone, and in the comment section, Scott, who is of a scientician bent, mentioned a technique or a little trick for degassing material when it starts to go out of the cup, when it's expanding more than the volume of your mixing cup. And as fate would have it, when I was mixing up this batch, I ran into exactly what he described, so I thought I would use his technique and with it properly credited to him in this video. So what you do when you start running out of space in your mixing cup, because you go through that cycle where your material expands and then it gives up those air bubbles, they break, and then the material collapses. Now, what Scott mentioned is when you're starting to overflow your mixing cup, you can bleed off a little bit of that vacuum and break that surface tension, and that helps burp those air bubbles out. So we're just going to release a little bit of the vacuum to get it to collapse a little bit, and then restore the vacuum until we go through that full collapse. And you might have to do that a couple of times, but I pinned Scott's comment at the top of the vacuum degassing video, so definitely check that out. Some good tips in there if you're curious about that. And now ready to pour our silicone. Now, it's important to remember the orientation of our part inside the mold. So I'm going to turn the mold at a slight angle to make sure I don't get any air entrapment in that coffee mug handle. So sometimes you want to do that. You might have to start your pour at a slight angle to make sure you don't get any air entrapment, and then slowly lower the mold down, and then that way you get everything filling up without trapping air bubbles. Now, it's important anytime you're working with a fast-setting material to be very conscious of your working time. So sometimes when you're starting out with a particular material, keep your smartphone handy with the time set for the working time on your timer, and that's a good way to keep track of that and make sure you get all the critical work done well within that work time. Now, this is about an hour and a half later, and I always like to check my mixing cup first and peel out whatever is inside that cup, and that's a good way to make sure that my part will have handling strength and everything is mixed and cured properly. Now, if everything has been released in accordance with the prophecy, we're able to release this coffee cup easily from our mold. But the first thing I want to do is go around and break that seal between the mold and the cast. And the tricky thing about this part is we essentially made a custom suction cup in this mold. So this coffee cup really wants to grip onto this mold. So you want to take your time, and what I'm doing here is breaking that seal around the outside, and then I'm going to reach in and break the inside suction where it's grabbing onto that plug in the negative space. So take your time and make sure everything is properly released, and you get good results. But if you miss even one little spot with mold release, you could easily wind up making a paperweight instead of a beautiful mold. So real important to make sure you understand this release technique before you make a critical part like this. Always good to practice on an old mold before you do something critically important. Now, I don't think this silicone has been tested for food contact, so I'm not going to be drinking coffee out of this cup, but that's not the point. I'm going to strike people in the head with it when they walk into my shop. So it will serve its purpose very well. And of course, as always, the product links will be in the video description, as well as some important video links on the end screen. So be sure to check those out. I will, in the upper left-hand corner, I'm going to have a link to the molding video if you missed that, and also the degassing videos and some other good ones from the past. So be sure to check out the links on the end screen. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course click the little bell icon so you get notified when we produce new content, which from now on will hopefully be every Monday. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you got some good new techniques out of this video and some new ideas.